Okay, so we're talking. So what are we talking about? We're talking about applying the text
Mm-hmm.
to the set. So this first one is going to be using. We're going to use Leviticus as an example, but this is the big idea. So we've got God who gives a relevant message to an original audience, right? Whether it's through Paul or through whoever speaks that message into the original audience, and then we are a contemporary audience, which is different to the original audience in lots of ways, with there's similarities between us in lots of ways as well, but often that exact same message, when it's just read to a contemporary audience, just seems completely irrelevant. And the first place people go to is something like Leviticus or stuff like that. People just think, how is this relevant? So so we're going to use Leviticus as a case study to look at all this kind of thing. So the big principle that we're going by, which is developed by this guy called Greidanus in his book Modern Preacher and the Ancient Text, is about discovering the original relevance. So when we're doing exegetical work, that's the most important part of the exegetical work, is getting at the end of that to answer the question, why is this relevant to the original audience? What's it actually trying to do? What's the goal of the text? What's it trying to do? What's it trying to achieve in the original text? So I've got that quote there. We must hear why the message was relevant for the original audience and transfer that relevant message to today. That's the task of application. So Leviticus 19:9. Let's have a read of that. Leviticus 19:9. When you reap the harvest of your land, there you go, harvest. There's that word, harvest.
Harvest. Leviticus, let me write that down.
When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Okay, so there's lots of. So let's look at this methodology that we've got here. Check out page 1. Page 2, step 1. Concentrate on the original relevance. Clarify the exegetical conclusions. How or why is this relevant to the original audience? So it says, when you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. What is going on there? Why was this relevant for them? That's the key question. So the key verse for understanding it when we kind of read it in context is Leviticus 19:2. So what I'm talking about here is the end point of a lot of exegetical work. It's not like it just comes to you in a moment. Done your exegetical work, and in your exegetical work you've discovered this. 19:2, it says, speak to the entire assembly of Israel and say to them, be holy, because I, the Lord your God, am holy. So that's the key verse for understanding everything that follows from it, including our verse in question. So Israel's question is, well, how? How do we be holy? The command there is, be holy because I, the Lord your God, am holy. Israel's like, how? And so this answers that question. It showed them one very practical way to act as God would and be holy. So it's interesting if you look into the background. In the background of at the time, the ancient Near East also had other practices, idolatrous practices, whereby as part of the fertility cults and worshipping the gods, they were commanded also to leave the edges of their field unharvested, and the purpose was that the edges of the field were an offering to the gods. Right, so it's interesting here how Yahweh gives the same command to his people, but he completely reverses it. So rather than the edges to be an offering to the gods, it's actually God is commanding them to leave it for the poor and for the alien. So that's the whole purpose, is so that the other people the poor and the alien can actually can harvest it. Exactly. I probably should have read that verse 10. Do not go over your vineyard a second time, or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner. So that's in the following verse. It's not actually in that verse. So it shows them one really practical way that they can actually act as God would, and that is care for the poor. So when we start to think about relevance, we want to transfer a relevant message to the contemporary audience. So how do we actually do that? So with something as abstract as this, what we can use is this thing called the ladder of abstraction. Okay, and this is in step 4 of the methodology that I've given you. Page 2, step 4. It says focus on the goal of the text. What was the goal of the message for the original audience? Was it to answer a question, encourage, correct, teach, motivate, etc.? So the goal of this text is about providing for the poor. So we're basically have the original passage for the original audience in mind, and we want to look for an underlying principle, which is what people almost always do by default anyway. And so that's good. So we can ask the question, what is the purpose or the justification given for the command? So you've got the command of leave the field unharvested. But why? Why are they telling him to do that? And so the justification comes in verse 10 as we read.
For the poor and the foreigner.
Exactly, leaving for the poor, for the foreigner. So it's about providing for the poor. So we can give a really concrete principle if you're just going to state that as a principle for the original people. Be holy by purposely harvesting your field inefficiently and allowing the poor to live off what remains. Something like that. That's just exactly what that's trying to say. And then so that is obviously not going to be relevant to our contemporary audience. Well, very few of us, especially in the suburbs, have even got a field, right? So it's not relevant. If you're talking to a rural, Victoria, maybe, but even still, there's no people. The poor aren't accessing the field, so even there, it's not relevant. So what we do is we use this thing called the ladder of abstraction, and that sounds complicated, but it's not. It's just a matter of that's exactly the same one as below it. We take the principle and we just try to develop increasingly, that's concrete, and then we create increasingly abstract versions of that principle. So the next version might be holy by providing for the poor from the surplus of your resources. And then even more abstract than that would be holy by providing for the poor. Even more abstract, be holy by acting as God would. And even more abstract than that, just be holy. That's just the principle.
So when you say abstract, you're almost looking at the bigger picture.
Yeah. It's hard to know exactly what I mean by abstract and concrete, but you just kind of get
abstract.
Yeah, it's hard to, I don't know what other word I can use. You are.
Because it's almost like you're
Drawing out from the
zooming out in some sense.
Yeah, that's right.
What would a field look like to us? Okay, we don't physically have a field, but what do we have?
Yeah, that's right.
What is it that
exactly.
provides for us? What is it that we make our
get
our income from? Where do we get our provisions from?
Yeah.
And out of that provision, we have the.
That's right. Yeah, so we don't even have to think about our own setting yet. We can just kind of do this exercise.
Okay.
So, for example, many years, 5 years ago or something, I was at the Leprosy Mission Hospital in Nepal and preaching, right? And so I was thinking to myself, how would I actually preach a message like this to them? Because the bottom level is not relevant. The second level is not relevant because they don't have surplus of resources. The next one is not even relevant because they've just literally the patients at the hospital have got nothing. They've just come with the shirt on their back. And so for them, it would be holy by acting as God would. That would just be the only way they could apply. If you were going to apply this text, that's how far abstract you'd have to go to try and apply it. So that's and then basically what you want to do is you want to start thinking about your own setting, and ask the question: what's the most concrete version of this? Of all these principles, what's the most concrete one that we can actually choose for our setting? So for us in suburban Australia, I'd say that one. Be holy by providing for the poor from the surplus of your resources. But, you know, if you're in a really poor environment, you know, in the suburbs, maybe you'd pick a different one. But I think for most of us that would probably be about right. So we choose that principle, and that's the principle that we use to transfer relevance to our audience. And then step 4 from that, we start to develop, using that principle, we start to develop contemporary applications which put that principle into practice. So you want to get as concrete as possible. So a couple of examples. In our church we have a bread run, or we had a bread run. So one of the concrete applications if I was preaching there would be holy by getting involved with the church's bread run, which collects and hands out bread to families on the food share program in local areas. So you guys probably do this at your churches. The bakeries purposely make extra bread, and then they just get people to hand out what's left over. So that's a classic way to apply.
In this context,
Yep.
the word purposefully and intentionally is actually quite interesting because
you're right.
you kind of lose it in the abstraction.
Yeah, you're right.
But the initial intent is actually to
Purposefully,
purposefully
yeah,
still
that's
sow
good.
there.
That's a really good point.
Anyway.
Yeah, so maybe you could add a couple extra layers of keeping the purposely bit in there. Yeah, it's good. I like that. It's a good point. Another one would be, because I work with youth and young adults, I'm always thinking about youth and young adults, so one concrete thing to them would be holy by sharing your lunch with a young person at school whose parents don't pack them lunch. That's something that they could potentially do. They could purposely ask their parents for more extra so that they can share it. Be holy by sponsoring a child through World Vision, caring for the poor from surplus of your resources. Be holy by making most of the food share thing at the local supermarket or those sorts of things. So that is what we usually do without even realising. But it's good to kind of have a method there that we can start to critique. So when people are doing dodgy applications, so where the heck did you get that application from? You start to have a language of like, well, what's a good way to do it, what's a bad way to do it, if you've actually got it written down. And so that's called the ladder of abstraction. It's one way of applying the text to a contemporary context. That's the whole thing, kind of.
That's all I've done.
Yeah. It's not yet, but I'll put it up. Yeah.
That's good.
So that's that.